today to give us a very important lecture that matter to us all. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we are ready for the lecture. So please welcome Prof.Dr.Lee Lai To give us the lecture. To audience for any question concerning the lecture, please type and indicate on the lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, for your kind introduction. Professor Shilajit, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank the School of Social Innovation for inviting me to give this public lecture. I think this is a good time for us to talk about China and ASEAN. I am from Singapore. This is the 25th anniversary of diplomatic ties between Singapore and China. So in that regard, President Xi Jinping actually went to Singapore for a visit. He saw Prime Minister Lee and quite a number of leaders in Singapore. On top of that, he had a meeting with Mae from Taiwan. So we were happy to be chosen as the venue for the leaders from both sides of the Taiwan Strait to meet in Singapore. Because that's historic. In the history of the People's Republic of China, the two leaders from both sides have not met until this month. More than 60 years. And it was held in Singapore. Right? But of course, in the case of Thailand, as mentioned by our chairperson, it is now the 40th anniversary of diplomatic ties between China and ASEAN. If I may add, likewise, the Philippines celebrating the 40th anniversary, right? Because Thailand and the Philippines established formal ties with China in the same year. So as a whole, it is indeed an opportune time for us to review China's relations with ASEAN. And that is precisely the major purpose of today's lecture, right? That is to review Sino-ASEAN relations. If you look at the map, I don't know if you've got a copy of the map, but China and ASEAN are actually two very important parts of the Asian landmass and maritime network. I think if you are here in Chiang Rai, you should know very well that China is physically very close to Thailand. You are close to Vietnam and southwestern part of China, right? But on top of that, there are always maritime routes between the coastal provinces of China and some of the Southeast Asian states like Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and so forth. So we have actually been interacting for quite a while, right? And historically, if you know a bit about the history of China, the way the emperor looked at the outside world is that he would consider himself as the son of heaven, right? From above. And he's got ruling over over the Middle Kingdom. The surrounding regions will be connected to China through what we call the tributary system. Right. So bear in mind that is how China looks at the outside world in the old days, right? So if I may, can I look at this slide? So true enough, this system, what we call the tributary system, dominated China's foreign policy or foreign relations with much of Southeast Asia until the 19th century. Why? Because of the invasion of the West into China. And China has always been saying that they have gone through what they call 100 years of humiliation, starting from the 19th century, and especially after what is called the Opium War. I mean, you are in Qinghai, perhaps you can go and visit the Hall of Opium, and you know what I mean. That with the Opium War, the Qing dynasty was actually on the decline. And as I said, the Chinese went through 100 years of humiliation. In the meantime, of course, what about we from Southeast Asia? Many of the Southeast Asian states became Western colonies. The Dutch, the French, the British came and colonized Southeast Asia. Right? The exception, of course, is Thailand, but most of us became colonies of the West. Alright? So bear in mind that there was this difference and gaps with the decline of the Qing dynasty, which is the last dynasty of China. Alright? And if you look at some of the Southeast Asian states, you have to bear in mind that when you look at China, they may look at China as a benign power. But at the same time, for some of them, they may think that China is a belligerent power. Why? Because from history, we know that China has invaded some of the Southeast Asian states, particularly the mainland Southeast Asian states like Vietnam. Right? So, if that is the case, things like this. So there's an image of an aggressive and even malignant northern power as China into the culture and even what I call collective memories of some of the Southeast Asian countries, notably in Vietnam and Myanmar. So when we look at China, it's actually a mixed feeling. If you talk to a Vietnamese, they may give you a different interpretation of the way you look at China. Alright? So it is a mixed feeling that they may have, alright, when you look at the big power in the north. And of course, when you talk about China's links with us, that is with South Asia, there is also what we call an ethnic dimension. What do you mean by ethnic dimension? For that, I'm talking about the Chinese dimension. The ethnic Chinese actually have a lot of links with China. When there were strong dynasties, like the Tang dynasty, they would not allow the Chinese to leave, whether it's to Southeast Asia, or to America, and to other places. Alright? In fact, those who wanted to leave would be considered as deserters. If you have a chance to visit China, and particularly if you go to Fujian, right, where many of the Chinese in Singapore and elsewhere came from, you notice that they have got a wall along the coast. You know the meaning of this wall in the old days? The wall was built to prevent the Chinese from leaving China by sea. They would not allow the Chinese to leave China. As I said, anybody leaving China would be a deserter. Alright? But all the same, for the poor and underprivileged, in China, that is, especially those from Guangdong and Fujian, they did migrate to what was called Nanyang. In our case, they call it Nanyang. You know what's the meaning of Nanyang? That's Chinese, but in English it is South Seas. They did migrate to the South Seas, especially those from Guangdong and Fujian. And that's why, when you look at the ethnic Chinese in Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Philippines, and so forth, they are mostly from Guangdong and Fujian, which are two southern provinces in China. Alright? And so these people migrate to Nanyang because they were poor and they were starving. So what choice would they have? And in the meantime, in Nanyang, that is in South Asia, the colonial governments were looking for cheap labor for development. For example, to work in the mines, work in the rubber plantations, and whatnot. They need cheap labor. What do they get? Not enough. So they try to get it from China. And so these Chinese migrants were welcome in a way because they provided cheap labor for development under the colonial government. Right? And that's why, they were able to get a decent living when they reached Singapore, Malaysia, and other places. Right? And so this sort of migration continued until 1949. That is until the communists took over in 1949. That is when the Communist Party established the regime for the people of the Republic of China in 1949. That migration stopped. Right? So most of the Chinese in South Asia actually came from the Chinese who left China for South Asia before 1949. Right? And when they came, they worked hard, of course. They sent the money back home to the hometown, somewhere in Guangdong. And of course, some of them even, took part in Chinese politics in the local context, in the sense that they supported people like the royalists like commemorate. It's then just not know. In the 18th period, there were a group of officials trying to reform, trying to strengthen China. And of course, to make a long story short, they failed, and they had to run for their life. And this fellow, supporting the emperor, had to leave China for Nanyang, for South Asia. Right? So he's one of the writers. The other one was Sun Yat-sen, who wanted to get rid of the Qing dynasty and establish a republic. Right? And so he came to South Asia too. Why? Because he needed funding, money, to fight against the Qing dynasty. He needed also manpower, volunteers to support his revolution. Eventually, he managed to depose the Qing dynasty in 1911. That was under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen. Last but not least, quite a number of the Chinese in South Asia also got involved in the Chinese communist movements, in the sense that they became leftist oriented and they looked to China as the ideological leader in launching a communist revolution in South Asia. So in that way, the Chinese are still very much connected to the motherland, so to speak. Because at that point, there was no Singaporean identity, no Malaysian identity. So they identified with the home country. The home country is China, was China, right? And so in that way, the links were quite obvious then, right? At least before 1949. But then after the rise of the PRC, that is after the communists took over, for those of you who have been studying international politics, you know very well that there was the onslaught of the Cold War, right? And the Cold War divided the Asian Pacific region into two camps. Which two? The socialist camp and the capitalist camp. The socialist headed by the Soviet Union and the capitalist camp headed by the United States. Anyway, in the case of the PRC, it was with the socialist camp, but for a large part of South Asia, it was with the capitalist camp, including Thailand. And so, in that way, what I'm saying here is that China and South Asia clearly drifted apart, ideologically or otherwise. And for much of the Cold War, Sino-Southeast Asian relations were strained by what I call the ideological divide in general and the so-called overseas problem and China's support for the communists in particular. So these were actually the problems between China and South Asia. The two sides could not get together because of the Cold War and because of this overseas China problem, because of this communist revolution movement in South Asia. And so now we come to ASEAN. When ASEAN was formed, as you know, in 1967, there was actually mutual hostility. Right? Because from China's perspective, ASEAN was created to work against the communists. ASEAN was working with the West against all communist governments, China, Vietnam, and the Soviet Union. Right? So no way that China could accept ASEAN at that time. That is the very beginning. But then, of course, things began to change. Right? What are the major changes that we should bear in mind? The most important change you have to bear in mind is no doubt the Sino-American detente. Some would say the Sino-American rapprochement. Right? In the sense that China and the United States came together, especially after President Nixon's visit to China, right? Arranged by Henry Kissinger. So they match up, and that way the United States had a chance to withdraw from Vietnam. Bear in mind that one major reason for the Americans to catch up with the Chinese was because of the war in Vietnam. The Americans were tired of the war in Vietnam, and there was many opposition to American involvement in the Vietnam War. I was a student in the United States, and I saw so many demonstrations on campus. So much so that eventually the United States decided that we better retreat. In order to retreat, the Americans would like to talk to the Chinese so that it could afford to have what they call an honorable withdrawal from Vietnam. Right? Alright, so that is actually one of the reasons that we should bear in mind when we talk about Sino-American detente. Why they did the two come together, right? And so, but to make a long story short, in the case of South Asia, when the two catch up, I'm quite sure that many of the Southeast Asian governments would have asked themselves, how would that affect me? Do I have to adjust my foreign policy? Now that China is working with the Americans, the thinking of at least some of the Southeast Asian countries was that we better move closer to China and establish formal ties with China so that at least there's a channel for us to talk about. That is the formal channel, right? So it was under these circumstances that some of the ASEAN countries established formal ties with China. On the screen, I mentioned Malaysia in 1974, Thailand and the Philippines in 1975. That's why we now have 40 years of formal ties. It all started in 1975, right? So, and when China and Vietnam were at loggerheads, that is, they fought against each other after the unification of Vietnam, things like this, then Vietnam, of course, invaded Cambodia. And because of this relation, China began to look upon ASEAN as a possible partner in restraining Vietnam's ambitions in China. Likewise, I would suggest that frontline states like Thailand also thought that it would be wiser to have some communication with the Chinese in order to restrain the Vietnamese ambitions in Indochina, right? And so those are the conditions under which the ASEAN thought that they would have to work with China for the security of ASEAN, right? And of course, that's not all. In the case of China, things began to change rapidly too. Why? That was because of the opening up of China. That was because of the full modernization launched by China under Deng Xiaoping. That is after the death of Mao Zedong. Okay? So when it opens up, we can see that it is more interested to promote economic ties. It's more interested to learn from Singapore, from Taiwan, from South Korea, from Hong Kong, and so on and so forth. Alright? And in fact, Deng Xiaoping went to Singapore for a visit in 1978. I still remember that. And it was in Singapore that then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew told Deng Xiaoping, you want to be friendly towards South Asia. Why don't you cut off your support to the communists in Southeast Asia? So Deng Xiaoping listened carefully and eventually learned that indeed China has cut off its support to the local communists because China would like to work with Singapore, work with Malaysia, work with Thailand, and so forth for its own economic modernizations. Why should it be bothered by the local communists, whether it's in Thailand, in Malaysia, and so forth? So indeed, cut off the ties to the local communists in South Asia. And so if that is the case, then I would suggest that you began to witness close economic cooperation between China and ASEAN. Right? Even after the Tiananmen incident of 1989, the Southeast Asian states continue to work with China, unlike many other countries in the West. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with the Tiananmen incident. That was the time when many students and workers demonstrated against the Chinese government. Right in Tiananmen Square, for those of you who have visited China, I'm sure you know you've been to Beijing and visited the big square, right? Called Tiananmen Square, right? It was there then that the students were fired by the Chinese military, and a lot of people got killed. And because of that incident, many of the Western countries began to boycott China in trade and investment. But in the case of ASEAN, in the case of some Southeast Asian countries, they were not that much bothered by the incident, right? So I put it here, they were not bothered so much. And they continue to trade and to invest in China. And so in that way, I would suggest that China had an incentive to be friendly towards neighboring Southeast Asian countries, because the Western countries were boycotting China. So if you look at surrounding areas, very friendly, right? So we continue with that. And to add to that, I would say that ASEAN by that time began to be really very active in regional affairs. ASEAN has been active in organizing what we call multilateral meetings. The ASEAN Regional Forum, Post-Ministerial Conference, and so forth, right? So the point we should note is that China would like to plug into this ASEAN circuit so that it can play a part in the multilateral meetings hosted by ASEAN, so that it will be interacting with more and more countries because of the meetings organized by ASEAN. Right? So in many ways, ASEAN was and is an active diplomatic community. Right? So it is vital to plug into that circuit, so to speak. That is from China's perspective. Right? So let's now talk about the breakthrough in Sino-ASEAN relations. How did China break into the ASEAN circuit, so to speak? Right? As I mentioned earlier, formal ties were established between China, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines way back in the 1970s. Right? But then I must add by saying that as a whole, relations between China and ASEAN were not particularly popular. Why? I will explain here. The crux of the matter was that China's relations with Indonesia were still a problem. And Indonesia is what we call the big brother of ASEAN. It is the biggest country. Alright? Bigger than Thailand too. Alright? And so, why did Indonesia not resume the political ties? Why were there reservations in Indonesia in having formal ties with China? Or resuming formal ties with China? So I'll try to explain here. The reason is, there was an attempted coup by the Indonesian Communist Party way back in 1965. Right? Many Indonesian generals and soldiers were killed because of the coup. If I were somebody from the Indonesian military, I would always have reservations about China. Because many of my colleagues, many of my former bosses were killed in this coup. Organized by the Indonesian Communist Party, allegedly supported by China. That's the problem. There were talks happening what is called a Jakarta-Beijing axis. That is under President Sukarno. And then of course Sukarno took over after the coup. The point you should note is that the Indonesians could not forgive China because of its involvement, or allegedly its involvement, with the coup of 1965. And the diplomatic ties were actually suspended in 1967. And the perception in Indonesia was China is a major security threat towards Indonesia. Right? And so in that way, no way Indonesia would like to have any interactions with China. Right? Because of its concern with its own security. Right? Then, of course, international relations began to change. Right? This can be a topic for another lecture. But let me just recap and highlight the more politics related to China. In the case of China, of course, I've already talked about the Sino-American atoms, and in 1979, China and the United States established formal ties. The Americans just ditched Taiwan. Taiwan was no longer recognized as the representative of China. Now they recognize Beijing as the representative of China, starting from 1979. Alright? And with the rise of Deng Xiaoping, as I said earlier, China began to put up. China began to interact with the outside world, and of course, there was the rise of China. Whether you like it or not, you have to talk to China because of the rise, because of its power, because of its economic resources. Right? So, under these circumstances, the Indonesian Foreign Ministry, a number of them, would tell President Suharto that it's totally unrealistic for us to ignore China, which we have to talk to China. Right? And then the Indonesian of Commerce. I was invited to give a talk to them, and I can see that they were very eager to break into the China market. Because everybody was talking about China at that point, and there were opportunities in China. So you don't go outside. You don't go, Singaporean, Malaysian, and Thai, Korean. And so you miss, a big opportunity to have, economic interactions and also economic upgrading by interacting with China. And so, as I said, the thinking was, Indonesia should bank on China's foreign organizations. It is also unrealistic to ignore China in regional affairs. Alright? Especially when you look at the Boeing issue and also South China conflicts. China is critical. If ever you want to solve it. Alright? And so it was under such circumstances that Indonesia resumed diplomatic ties with China in August 1990. Right? And with that, we followed suit. And Brunei likewise did the same in the 1990s. Well, since I'm from Singapore, let me just say a few words about our ties with China. For Singapore, our ties with China are mainly economic in nature, trade, investment, and so on and so forth. In fact, my personal paper on that I say is economics in command. Right? And that is the most critical part. Singapore is very practical. Right? And by the time when they interacted with China, there was less concern about the loyalty of its own ethnic Chinese. Bear in mind that in the old days, especially the older generation, they don't think Singapore was their country. They think the motherland was China. So it is a problem if you want to build Singapore up as an independent nation, right? Fortunately, given more time, the younger generation began to identify Singapore as their own country, right? And in that way, as I said, there was less concern about the loyalty of the ethnic Chinese, right? And then Singapore used to be dubbed as the so-called third China, yeah? Because there are so many Chinese in Singapore, they think, oh, Singapore is another China, right? It's the third China. First is of course China, second China is Taiwan, third China is Singapore, right? And so we have to tell our ASEAN friends, including the Thais here, that no, we are very different. We are Chinese, but we are Singaporean Chinese. We identify with Singapore as our country. So in that way, to some extent, we were quite successful in dispelling what is called the third China image, right? Last but not least is the communists. The reason why we were merged with Malaysia was because of the threat from the communists. But when the agreement of Deng Xiaoping to cut its support to the communists, we can see that communism is no longer appealing to the people in Singapore. Alright? In the old days, no. We have Chinese supporting China, identifying with China. But if you talk to the younger generation in Singapore, I don't think they really look to China, right? Chances are they look at the United States, they look at Britain, they look at Australia, right? Or rather China, right? Okay, anyhow, because of all these changes, Singapore, of course, felt more comfortable in having diplomatic ties with China, alright? And when we have formal ties with China, that was in 1990, late 1990, it was a very simple affair. We don't want to make a big fuss out of it. So if you look at our joint statement with China, when we established formal ties, there were only one or two sentences in the communique. I can't really remember the exact wording, two sentences that said, we'll establish formal ties and exchange ambassadors. That's how we establish formal ties with China. We did not talk about Taiwan issue, how to resolve them, whether it's one China, one Taiwan. No. We did not say anything like that. We simply said that we'll have formal ties and exchange ambassadors. Full stop, that's all. Right? But before that short statement was signed, there were a lot of discussions behind the scenes, of course, right? Because we do have some problems in working with China. What are these? One, our leaders could no longer visit Taiwan, including Lee Kuan Yew. Because, Lee Kuan Yew used to visit Taiwan very often. Young Kuo is his good friend, right? And sometimes once in a while when Lee Kuan Yew is sick, he'll go to Taiwan to see a doctor, right? Because the medical care in Taiwan is actually very good, right? And so there were a lot of discussions on that, and we insisted that we should be allowed to go, just the same. And so the agreement was, okay, if you insist, only low-profile visits to Taiwan. Don't try to make it, like a big event. When you go, behind the scene and take a low profile. Alright? That was the agreement. The second one, of course, it is important for China, that we have to change the name of Taiwan's presence in Singapore from ROC, Republic of China, to Taipei Trade Representative Office. In other words, you cannot use Taiwan's official title ROC, Republic of China. Because once you use this term, it means that you have a two-China policy, which is not acceptable to China. China insists in having a one China, and that is the PRC, not the ROC. Right? And so, if you want to join the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and do a deal with China, make sure you plan this in mind. Otherwise, you will create a lot of problems for your government. Right? China will kick out big fuss because you Thai officials are using this official name in Taiwan, and you got yourself into trouble too. Right? So that way, bear this in mind. This term cannot be used in all official correspondence with the PRC, that is the government regime, right? And so, last but not least, we have to discuss with the Chinese that we'll continue to have our Starlight project. I don't know if you are aware of that. Singapore has been sending its military, our army boys, to Taiwan for training. Because we don't have the space, to train our army. Singapore is so small. Our Air Force, once it takes off, will fly to Malaysia and Indonesia. So how can we train our military? So we look around, and Taiwan was willing to provide the manpower and the resources and space for us to train our army. And that's why under this project called Starlight Project, we have been sending our soldiers to Taiwan for training. Do you think it's a problem if you want to have ties to the other side? That is China. So China raised the issue, and eventually they said, okay, our soldiers are trained to fight, not against China, but because of our concern of security threats from nearby areas. So we seek the understanding of the Chinese that we need space in Taiwan to train our army corps. We also impress on the Chinese that we send them to Taiwan and other places for training too, not just Taiwan. So Taiwan is just one of the places where we train our soldiers. So eventually, the Chinese said, okay, we will not really object much. They did not really involve it. There's no objection. Right? You can do whatever whatever you want, right? As long as you bear in mind that your soldiers are meant for maintaining the security of Singapore. It is not meant to fight against China. Okay? So that was the understanding, right? So after Singapore, then Brunei followed. And let me just go on to the next slide, right? How to break into the ASEAN circuit. Of course, when we look at China, its big size, its proximity, geographically, its ethnic coverage, lack of transparency in defense, will always create real and imagined problems, right? In big things, right? And so, it is a problem. But it is a problem. Then the thinking was that we have to engage China. We have to talk to China. And ASEAN has been adopting what we call step-by-step approach in engaging China. Alright? To make a long story short, because of the limitation of time, let me just mention that eventually, of course, the step-by-step approach led to the invitation of China to join the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is the major security meeting for all the countries in the Asia-Pacific region, hosted by ASEAN. Right? Next, please. And China evidently was happy to join the RF and some meetings. Right? At first, it was not so active. Right? But then later on, began to use multilateral meetings. Once they learned that these meetings are not to be fighting against China, that they can use all these meetings to dilute the influence of the Americans. The Chinese began to be very active. Right? And then they will support us in what's called a driver's seat in organizing all these multi meetings. Right? Next slide, please. And so, in economic terms, the Chinese try to be helpful. For example, the most important indicator that China has become for is the launching of this ASEAN-China free trade area. This agreement has already been implemented starting from 2010. And because of this, it greatly facilitated the trade between China and ASEAN, including Thailand, right? In fact, Singapore is now the top foreign investor in China for the last 2 years, right? And so China likewise is also investing in ASEAN. Next slide. And I would suggest that when they launch the Maritime Silk Road, there will be more investments from China, right? So with that, let me just move on to some of the problems that you may have when you're trying to cooperate with China. No doubt, in terms of trade, economic, yes, it's very, very close. But there are actually competition. There are also even conflicts. Let me just briefly go through some of these problems that we may encounter when we look at China. What are these? One, of course, is the competition for investment, competition for foreign markets. Because some of the ASEAN countries are in a similar stage of development to China. Our products are the same. We are also trying to attract the same foreign direct investments. And so don't you think that there's competition? Because some of these, they won't come here. They go to China. Right? They won't come to Thailand. They won't go to Singapore. And so there is some sort of competition for what we call FDI, foreign markets. When you want to export, we are looking at more or less the same market. The US, Europe, and so on and so forth. Again, there is competition between China and ASEAN. But I think the most serious conflict that we have with China is no doubt the South China Sea territorial disputes. I've actually spent one full lecture on that for another class, right? Let me just summarize problems that we have with China in the case of South China Sea. Alright? The South China Sea involved quite a number of parties, and the most serious conflict is, of course, the Straits, which is the largest South China Sea group. Right? And of course, there are so many parties involved in that conflict, including some of the other states. And from China's perspective, it's like this: they claim to have indisputable sovereignty over all the islands in South China Sea. Right? If you look at the Chinese claim, their maps will show that they have 9 nations encircling all the islands in South China Sea. Alright? So in that way, it is going to be a problem because some of us, namely Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, Vietnam, and so forth, are also claiming at least parts of this practice. But in the case of Vietnam, the whole of the South China Sea, right? And all of us involved in the conflict, except Brunei, have already stationed troops in the area. So I would suggest that there could be conflicts, military conflicts, by design or by accident. Right? And so the situation there, as I've said in the other lecture, it could be a time bomb. The bomb will not explode right away, but if we don't manage it properly, it will explode. Alright? So before it's too late, we have to do something, trying to see if we can work something out with the Chinese is like this. And in the case of Chinese, okay, it's a problem, recognize that, but we'll talk to you only bilaterally, one-to-one. Right? No internationalization of the issue. The Chinese will not go to any multilateral forums. They will not go to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. They will not put the case before the UN, but he just wants to talk to you bilaterally. Because that is to the advantage. China is big. You ask Brunei to talk to China, Brunei will feel integrated because it's a big country. Right? So anyway, that's the Chinese approach. But then for some of us, we prefer to use the UN law of the sea to resolve the conflicts. And in the case of the Philippines, we like to present the case to the Permanent Court of Arbitration to see whether they have a case, including parts of this practice. Right? But of course, bear in mind for this issue, it's not just for China and some of the ASEAN states. The Americans, the Indians, the Japanese, and possibly the Australians, and other users of the seaways are also interested and concerned about the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. And so they will also play a role. And some of them will also be interested in having joint developments of the South China Sea. Because after all, there is oil, there is supposed to be gas in the South China Sea, right? So this is actually one of the most important conflicts that we have with the Chinese, right? So that's perhaps we move on to other issues, which is basically water-based resources that can harm the relationship between China and ASEAN. Of course, the South China Sea is one major water resource that we have a problem with China, but since you're from Qinghai, you should know very well that the Mekong River, the Mekong Basin, could be a source of conflict between China and some of the countries in ASEAN. The reason is that China is building dams in the upper reaches of the Mekong River. Right? And the building of these dams, as you know, will affect the farming, fishing communities. It will also affect the local communities on downstream Southeast Asian states, right? Including Thailand, and especially Cambodia and other places, Vietnam too. And so, for China is insisting that it is one way they can develop what's called hydropower, hydroelectricity. It's cleaner and greener, and it's a very important source of energy for them. So they will press on to build the dams. And I would say that that's a problem between China and some countries in South Asia, right? That are affected by building these dams, right? And these dams. And so the final problem, if I may just add a little bit, is actually the Sino-ASEAN border, right? And the disputes at the border. Why? Basically, they are related to China's links and support for border minority groups. For those of you from Myanmar, I'm sure you know very well that these minority groups, Wa, Kachin, and so forth, could be linked to China and could be getting support from China in dealing with the central government, right? So in that way, I would suggest that if you examine it deeper, then you know that it could be a source of problem between China and at least some people, as I said, especially Myanmar, for example, right? But I must add by saying that China has already resolved the land boundary between Vietnam and China, right? That's done. I mean, add a little bit. It has also resolved the boundary in the Gulf of Tonkin, right? The Gulf of Tonkin between China and Vietnam. The residual conflicts, of course, are always the parasites in this pattern, right? So with that, let me conclude. I'm still 5 minutes or 6 minutes old. Let me make a few concluding remarks, right? Yeah. Now, in spite of the problems and conflicts, I think China and ASEAN have agreed that such differences should not hamper the overall cordial relationship between the two sides. Alright? By and large, I would suggest that our leaders in ASEAN, the leaders in China, are intelligent enough to see the bigger picture. Alright? I mean, if you just talk about South China Sea War, very serious, very problematic. But there are other things that you can work on, right? There are other areas that we can work together with China. That's why I thought, and in the case of Thailand, it's been actually doing the right thing. Yeah, we know that South China Sea is a problem, but can we just put it aside and then work on other areas that we can work together? Trade, investment, obviously, the areas that we can work together, right? So Singaporeans, yes, we are concerned about South China Sea because we depend on shipping. If there are problems in South China Sea, our economy will be affected. But we are actually in a position to say that, okay, it's a problem, but I'll work with China and invest there. So that Singapore is a top investor in China. So South China Sea is not a problem in that way, right? So in that way, of course, you must not blow the issue, the problem, out of proportion. Because if that is the case, it will harm the overall cordial Sino-ASEAN relations. The South China Sea, yes, it is a problem. But I suggested here, why don't we just spend some time talking about joint development and putting aside the issue of sovereignty disputes. Alright? So it is actually going to be mutually beneficial, right? If there is joint development. And of course, I must add by saying that I've been proposing some projects too for them to develop jointly. But all these proposals have not been able to take off. Why? Because once you have picked a place for joint development, there's got to be one or two countries in that area belongs to me. You keep on. Because every single inch of the South China Sea is claimed by somebody. So you start joint development. So it's easier said than done, although that is the overall direction that we should take. Alright? And finally, I would say that so far when we talk about problem, when we interact with Chinese, it's always at official level. Right? Mainly restricted to diplomats and trade officials. But then I have noticed, the last slide, that actually the problems could involve a wide range of industries. Notably, some of these could be related to defense, security. So you have to involve the military, the soldiers, the officials from the Ministry of Defense. Other than that, yes, discussions are always at the top, at the very elitist level. But then bear in mind that some of these problems should be related to the local government. For example, the problem in the Mekong River, Mekong Basin. It could be related to the local government. The South China Sea conflict could be related to the local government. For example, in the case of China, it could be related to Hainan. Hainan is the province governing the South China Sea. So it cannot be just Beijing. Beijing will have to liaise with Hainan. And that's why you have to involve the local officials. Last but not least, I would say that it's wiser to engage our joint interactions on what is called people's level. At our level, that is people's level. You go to China as a tourist, you interact with the Chinese come to Korea, and they see Thailand, they see Singapore, and they see Malaysia. Hopefully, with all these dialogues and interactions, then you can promote what we call transparency and understanding, making China and ASEAN to be more responsive to each other's needs, concerns, and aspirations. Alright? With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.